Welcome back to AI Phantasmata, where we venture into the unknown, one terrifying story at a time. Tonight we're diving into the shadowy origins of a creature that refuses to stay dead. This is the tale of the Revenant, an undead being driven not by hunger or primal instinct, but by something darker. Revenge, rage, or the need to finish what it started in life. Revenants are unlike any other undead you may have heard of. Unlike zombies, they don't stagger mindlessly. And unlike vampires, they don't seduce their victims. These are the souls who claw their way back to the world of the living, their bodies decayed, yet driven by a disturbing purpose. We're about to explore what calls them back, the forms they take, and the horrors they bring. As we go deeper, remember, this is more than just a story. The fear of revenants has haunted humanity for centuries, so turn off the lights, sit back, and prepare to face the terrifying legend of the Revenant. The origins of the Revenant go back centuries, rooted in the shadowy corners of medieval Europe, where fear and superstition shaped the way people understood the world and the dead. Some of the earliest accounts come from the writings of medieval chroniclers, like William of Newburgh and Walter Map, who documented terrifying encounters with the dead that refused to stay buried. In these early stories, revenants were described as former friends, neighbors, or even family members who, after death, returned to haunt their communities. They weren't just mindless corpses or ethereal spirits. They had purpose, memory, and malice, often returning to settle scores, spread disease, or sow fear among the living. But what separates a revenant from the more familiar vampire or zombie? Unlike zombies, revenants aren't mindless. They remember their grudges, their enemies, and their unfinished business. And unlike vampires, they don't crave blood or eternal life. Instead, their motivations are often deeply personal, and that makes them terrifyingly unpredictable. In the lore, revenants rise from their graves with twisted, decaying bodies, their faces often marked by the bitterness or anger that brought them back. In life, they may have been wronged, betrayed, or cursed, leaving them restless even in death. And in some tales, a person could become a revenant simply from a life of sin, their souls forever trapped between worlds. This idea of the Revenant, a being brought back by anger, injustice, or a cursed existence, resonated deeply with medieval communities. It fed on their fears, serving as a grim reminder of what might happen if the dead weren't properly laid to rest, or worse, if the living had wronged them. The Revenant is no ordinary undead. It is the physical manifestation of unresolved bitterness and vengeance, a force that refuses to fade with death. And as we'll see, the stories that follow are as terrifying as they are fascinating. Now that we know where the Revenant legend began, let's take a closer look at what defines this terrifying creature and why it comes back from the dead. Revenants are often described as looking exactly how you'd imagine a vengeful corpse would. Decayed, grotesque, and filled with an unnatural malice. Their bodies, though decaying, are animated by a dark energy, making them disturbingly strong and resilient. Eyes that should be hollow seem to burn with bitterness, and their movements, though stiff and unnatural, are driven by a single-minded purpose. But what really makes the Revenant terrifying isn't just its appearance, it's its motivation. These beings don't rise from the grave by accident or some mindless hunger. No, revenants come back for a reason. Most often they're fueled by vengeance or unfinished business. Maybe they were betrayed, murdered, or wronged in life, and now they return to seek justice or revenge on those who wronged them. In other stories, revenants rise simply from a cursed or sinful life. Unlike spirits who may linger because of regret, these creatures are driven by something darker, an undying hatred or thirst for retribution that binds them to the world of the living. What's perhaps most chilling about the Revenant is its power. In many tales, revenants are said to spread fear, sickness, and even death. Some were believed to bring disease to entire communities, infecting the living just by their presence. In these stories, revenants are more than just physical threats. They're harbingers of doom, reminders that some wrongs cannot be easily buried. Driven by vengeance, cursed by death, and gifted with an unnatural strength, the Revenant is no ordinary ghost or zombie. It is a force with purpose, a being that has returned not only to haunt, but to settle its score, whatever the cost. And it's this unrelenting nature that makes the Revenant one of the most feared figures in undead lore. Throughout history, there have been countless stories of revenants, real encounters documented by witnesses who claim to have faced these vengeful undead. Let's look at some of the most famous cases that chilled entire communities to their core. One of the earliest and most notorious accounts comes from the English historian William of Newburgh. In the 12th century, Newburgh recorded stories of revenants that terrorized small villages across England. One tale tells of a man in Yorkshire who had been known for his wicked behavior. After his death, villagers reported seeing him rise from his grave at night, spreading disease and fear. The villagers, terrified, ultimately dug up his body, decapitated it, and burned it to stop his undead torment. In medieval Europe, revenants were not mindless, decaying corpses like modern zombies. They were more complex, troublesome figures with specific intentions, often to terrify, control, or punish. Many medieval stories describe revenants as reanimated corpses capable of inflicting illness or even death on their victims. One tale recounts a revenant disturbing his own family by slipping into bed with his wife, nearly crushing her with his unnatural weight. When he failed to frighten her further, he turned to terrorize his brothers and even the family animals. Eventually, the bishop ordered a letter of absolution placed on the revenant's chest, which finally quelled its unrest. Revenants in these stories seem clever, even cunning. Some tried to attend church services, gathering to hold their own ghostly mass. In one case, a priest who dared to interrupt them was dragged to the altar and burned. And they could shapeshift too. Some revenants shifted forms to avoid capture or to continue haunting. These accounts show revenants as intelligent and focused, driven by spite, vengeance, or simply the desire to wreak havoc on those they left behind. They remind us that even centuries ago, the fear of the dead coming back with unfinished business was a haunting thought. The Revenant stories are echoes of a deep ancient fear, of what happens when the dead refuse to rest. These stories became notorious, fueling a collective fear of what might happen if the dead came back with unfinished business. But the idea of the Revenant isn't limited to England or France. Across Europe, similar legends emerged, each with its own local twist. In Germany, the Nachtseher was a type of revenant believed to rise from the grave to feed on its own flesh, bringing death and despair to its family. And in Norse mythology, we find the Draga, an undead being that haunted the living, guarding its treasures and attacking anyone foolish enough to disturb its grave. These tales of revenants not only terrified those who heard them, but also served as cautionary tales. They warned that unresolved hatred or a cursed life could lead to an eternal nightmare, one where even death offers no escape. For medieval communities, these stories weren't just folklore. They were real threats, reinforcing the need to honor the dead, resolve disputes, and keep one's soul at peace. From the Yorkshire Revenants to the Draga of Norse myth, these famous stories remind us that some spirits are far too restless, far too vengeful to stay buried. And the only thing scarier than meeting a revenant is being the one it's come back for. So what do you do if a revenant rises from the grave to haunt the living? Medieval communities had their own gruesome methods to ensure that the dead stayed in their graves. Stopping a revenant was no easy task, and it required courage, ritual, and sometimes a bit of violence. One of the most common methods was decapitation. By severing the head from the body, people believed they could break the revenant's connection to the living world. Often the head would be buried separately or turned to face the ground, anything to prevent the revenant from finding its way back. Staking the corpse was another widely used technique. While we often associate this with vampires, staking was originally used to pin down the dead, to trap them in their graves. Iron or wood stakes were driven through the heart or limbs to ensure the revenant couldn't rise again. In some cases, iron nails were hammered into the coffin lid, creating a barrier between the living and the dead. For some revenants, however, these measures weren't enough. Burning the body was seen as the ultimate way to cleanse and purify, reducing the revenant to ash. In many legends, this act was done at night, with priests or the bravest villagers gathering around the pyre. The sight and smell of burning flesh were believed to release the tormented soul. freeing it from its vengeful mission. In addition to these physical methods, there were also rituals and prayers. Priests or shamans would perform rites to cleanse the spirit and send it peacefully to the afterlife. Some communities believed that only through sacred rituals could a restless spirit be calmed and a revenant permanently put to rest. The power of the revenant was feared so deeply that these methods were not just acts of protection, they were acts of survival. These communities were willing to do whatever it took to make sure the dead stayed dead. And these rituals remind us of an unsettling truth. When it comes to the undead, sometimes even death itself needs to be conquered twice. The legend of the Revenant may be ancient, but its influence echoes into modern horror in ways we still recognize today. While we may no longer believe in revenants haunting our villages, the themes they represent, vengeance, unfinished business, and the terror of the restless dead, live on in the stories we tell. In modern culture, revenants have inspired everything from zombies to vengeful spirits. They remind us of our fears about what could happen if the dead don't stay dead. Think about classic horror films where the antagonist rises from the grave, driven by rage or a curse, refusing to be silenced. This relentless pursuit, this unstoppable hunger for retribution, is pure revenant. The revenant also shares its DNA with creatures like the vampire, not because it drinks blood, but because it embodies a dark personal revenge on those who failed to respect or honor it in life. And while vampires have evolved into seducers and zombies, into mindless hordes, the revenant stays focused, driven by that burning desire for justice or vengeance. What makes the revenant especially chilling is that it's not a faceless, unknown monster. It was someone, a neighbor, a friend, even a family member. Its ties to the living world make it that much scarier. In folklore and literature, the revenant reminds us of the dangers of unresolved grudges, of sins that refuse to be buried. Even now, stories of spirits returning for revenge, of restless souls unable to move on, are found in every culture. From haunted houses to cursed burial grounds, the revenant persists in new forms, adapting to our modern fears but never losing that core of rage and relentlessness. As we look back on these ancient stories, we realize the revenant is more than just a monster. It's a reflection of our own fears. The fear of being haunted by our past, of leaving things unfinished, of the darkness that lingers even after life. The revenant may have faded from superstition, but its legacy continues to haunt us in the stories we tell, and perhaps in the shadows that still make us look over our shoulders. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark legend of the Revenant. We hope you're leaving with a new understanding of what makes this creature so terrifying, and why it continues to haunt us in myths and stories even today. The Revenant is more than just a figure of horror. It's a reminder of the unfinished, the unsettled, and the unforgiven. A creature that comes back not by accident, but by purpose. A warning that sometimes death isn't the end, but just the beginning of a new nightmare. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Revenant and want to see more haunting stories from the depths of folklore, mythology, and horror, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And tell us in the comments, what would you do if you encountered a Revenant driven by rage, staring right at you? Until next time, keep watching the shadows, because you never know what might be staring back.